It's a bit embarrassing to show, but this is our gaming recording setup. It wasn't very fun to record in this space, especially because we had to lean our tripod against the back of the TV. Well, management had had enough and assigned me the task of building a media console. Let's get some supplies and get started. For this project, I bought some pre-finished 3/4 inch birch plywood. There's a lot of surface area on this project, and I didn't want to have to try to get a perfect finish on all of it. Or maybe it's me just being lazy, not sure. To pair with the plywood, I got some pre-dimensioned 2x2 red oak blanks to use as legs. Smooth. Just like any other project, I'll start by cutting down my parts to size. These sheets are too large for my table saw, so I'll batch cut them using a straight edge and my circular saw. And since these are pre-finished, I have to take every precaution to preserve the finish, like using 30 feet of painter tape to protect the edge and the top. If you saw my last video, then you know how badly thin veneered plywood splinters. I double check my measurements and make the cut. All that tape was so worth it. Because these were rough cut at Home Depot, I spun the whole thing around and did the same to the other side. I must have been trying to work a little too quickly because this happened. Rest in peace, camera. It did work for the rest of the project, I just had to be a bit more careful. After the main cross cuts have been made, I ripped the top and bottom to their final widths. Even though these 2x2 were pre-dimensioned, I still had to square them up. I took only about a 32nd of an inch off two sides. I then moved over to the miter saw to cut them to length, making sure my saw was calibrated properly and I had the dust collection on. Next, I measured and cut the center shelf to length. And then repositioned the fence to cut Hey! What happened? My camera died? Dang it. Well, let me recreate this scene for you. I measured and I cut the center dividers to rough dimension in order to size perfectly when I dry assemble everything. Okay, back to the center shelf. I cut the shelf to final length, maybe not as safely as I should have. This ratio of wood could have been handled better with a crosscut sled, but it got the job done and it seemed to work out alright. The next morning I came out to the shop and dusted off the old dado stack to cut some grooves. I've seen that one of the best ways to get the perfect size for dado is to set up the stack on a flat surface, start stacking blades and spacers until you get just a hair thicker than your desired wood thickness. From there you can dial it in with test cuts, which is exactly what I did. In order to keep the dust down as well as keeping the cut clean, I created somewhat of a zero clearance insert. I made it with MDF and just cut notches where the leveling tabs are. There are tons of videos on YouTube how to make these, some even for your specific saw. Cutting dados is like the story of Goldilocks. This one's too loose. This one's too tight. This one's just right. Alright, this has got to be one of my favorite satisfying aspects of woodworking, watching the layout lines completely disappear while cutting the dado. Super satisfying, right? No? Just me? Okay. I'm not weird, you're weird. Let's watch it again. Alright, it's time for some notches. I recently watched a woodworker on Instagram do this. Before he made cuts with a jigsaw, he scored the lines with an X-Acto blade so it wouldn't splinter. It was genius. But me being too careful, I used some painter's tape anyway. Not too shabby. I rinsed and repeated for all the parts that will receive legs. I copied my lines from the top to the bottom without measurements to get an exact replica of the layout. I then marked start and stop lines on the legs. The markings show where the legs would join to the plywood. I did this because I'd be routing out a chamfered edge, and if I did that for the whole length of the leg, there'd be gaps in the corners. Time for everyone's favorite, sanding. I gave all the legs a generous sanding and hand chamfered the tops and bottoms of each leg. This way, if you ever decide to move the media console while it's on the ground, the leg bottoms wouldn't splinter and chip. Before finish, I used a tack cloth to get rid of any remaining sawdust. Gloves are a lifesaver here. No one likes sticky hands. Now I'm using some semi-gloss lacquer here to finish the oak legs. It matches the pre-finished sheen of the plywood and gives it a slightly warmer look, which is what the boss wanted. I gave all the sides a few thin coats and gave the end grain even more coats. Must have been warm out that day. Pro tip, stay hydrated. I came back a little later and gave them one final coat, and they were done. To attach the legs to the table, I opted for pocket holes, yet again, but this time it wasn't my usual setup. I took the block out of the jig and clamped it directly to the plywood. I did this for all the notches. I figured that since the legs are 1.5 inches, I could attach the legs from all angles with the screws and they wouldn't collide with each other. After dry assembly off camera, I cut the dividers to their final size so they could fit in between the dados I cut earlier. I then masked off the top and lacquered the plywood edges. My wife liked the look of the exposed plies rather than me edge banding them with solid wood. All of the other exposed plywood edges got the same treatment as well. Time for assembly. I started with what seemed to be the most difficult part, just so I had an easier time gluing up the larger pieces. I got everything aligned, added clamps, and made sure everything was square before I left it to dry overnight. After it was dry, I removed the clamps and it was time for the bigger assembly. I had to prop up the edges on a side cabinet as I don't have an assembly table this big, and my knees are pretty bad, so I couldn't work on the floor either. I glued it all up, clamped it together, adjusted for square one more time, and inserted one of the center legs to check alignment. Looks all good, now I can continue with assembly. I attached all the legs with the pocket holes from underneath, making sure those routed areas match the joint for a clean look. And with this last leg being joined to the shelf, this media console is done. I can clean up, show the boss, and set it up. Now let's take a quick look at the before. Messy. Wires everywhere. No room for expansion. It wasn't a very comfortable place to record gaming. Until now. There's a lot of room in those cubby holes for decorations and more electronics. The open concept lets the systems breathe, and it's just overall more inviting. We love it. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. This was a super fun build. I loved all the challenges it made me go through, and it made me a better woodworker. So I'll probably end up adding a door to hide these cords. I have some concealed hinges. So yeah, if you enjoyed, please leave a like, comment on it. Let me know if there's anything that I should have done differently. Yeah, hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.